Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Protecting Cultural Heritage, the Need for Proactive Policy. My name is Tess Davis, and I'm Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition. Our not-for-profit organization and think tank unites a diverse group of experts in the fight against antiquities looting and trafficking. And since our start, a key priority has been advocacy and outreach, helping policymakers, the private sector, and the general public better understand the illicit trade, its implications, and more importantly, how to fight back. Events like today's are one way that we reach these audiences, and certainly this mission is more important than ever. From recent conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine, it seems we're witnessing never-ending cultural catastrophes, and war is not the only threat. Looting and trafficking feed upon any crisis, whether it's one caused by natural disasters, globalization, climate change, or pandemics. And this has pushed all of us, whether in civil society, the art market, law enforcement, or governments, into a position where we're constantly reacting to the latest crisis, and moreover, reacting too late with too few resources. So how can we break that cycle and respond proactively? When we were drafting our 2021 report, Safeguarding Cultural Heritage in Conflict Zones, a roadmap for the G20, this was one of the most critical questions that we tackled. And it's also the topic of our discussion today. And we're very lucky to be joined by a panel of globally recognized experts who have devoted their careers to this issue. It's my pleasure to first introduce our guide to this topic today, our moderator, Professor James Reep, a professor at the University of Georgia, where he teaches law and preservation. I was lucky enough to be his student there while at the University of Georgia School of Law, but I will say his teaching only scratches the surface of his service to the field of preservation. Professor Reep has worked on preservation issues around the world, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, Central Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Caribbean. And he's currently the Secretary General of the Committee on the Legal Committee at ICOMOS, as well as a fellow and legal advisor to US ICOMOS. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Jordan and Moscow, and in 2016, President Obama appointed Professor Reep to the Presidential Cultural Property Advisory Committee. So before we begin, just a few words on technology. As you no doubt saw from the message from Zoom, today's webinar is being recorded for future use. And for those of you in the audience, we and our panelists would love to hear from you during today's events. We encourage you to take advantage of Zoom's interactive features, particularly the chat and the Q&A, and we'll be saving time for questions from you. So with that, I'll turn it to Professor Reep. Thank you, James, for joining us. We're thrilled to have you and all of our panelists here today.
Thank you, Tess. It's a real pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel today, talking about a really critical topic. As you pointed out, while we address things after they happen, a proactive approach to the protection of cultural property in the area of illicit trafficking is absolutely necessary. And this panel today will address some of the approaches that we might take to that. The program will begin with a series of brief questions that will be addressed by each of the panelists, touching various aspects of the problem. And then we'll have a general discussion among the panelists, and finally address questions and answers from the audience. So I'm looking forward to this very much. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists, beginning with Dr. Neil Brody, who's been researching illicit trade in cultural objects since 1997. He's held positions at Oxford University, the British School in Athens, the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at Cambridge University, where he was research director of the Illicit Antiquities Research Center. Stanford University's Archaeology Center, the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at the University of Glasgow, a very distinguished series of appointments. He's a member of the UK Committee of the Blue Shield, an expert member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and a corresponding member of the Archaeological Institute of America. And he works and has worked on archaeological projects in the UK, Greece, Jordan, and continues his work in Greece. Importantly, he's been the co-author of the Safeguarding Cultural Heritage in Conflict Zones, a roadmap for the G20 to combat illicit trade in cultural objects, produced by the Antiquities Coalition. Our second speaker is Isber Sabrine, a Syrian archaeologist specializing in cultural heritage management, as well as a certified national tourist guide in Syria. But he's been a member of the Syrian Spanish team of the Spanish National Research Council since 2005, and since 2011, a researcher at the Institución Milá y Fontanals of the Spanish National Research Council, and involved in projects and studies on the protection of cultural heritage during conflicts. He's currently chair and co-founder of the international NGO Heritage for Peace, and since 2015, he's been involved in cultural initiatives for refugees and immigrants in Europe. He's also a co-author of Safeguarding Cultural Heritage in Conflict Zones, along with Neil Brody. Our next speaker, Vijay Kumar, is a fellow of the Cost and Management Accountants of India and a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers, London. The sculpture and Indian temple art is his real passion. He hails from Chennai, but moved to Singapore in 2006 as the general manager of a leading container line, a shipping company overseeing their landside operations in Southeast Asia. He's been writing extensively on sculpture and art appreciation and targeting early audiences to introduce them to understanding the nuances of Indian sculptural art. In early 2014, Vijay and his core team of volunteers formed India Pride Project, a social media initiative to combat the rampant looting of Indian art treasures, and has been instrumental in tracking of high-profile trafficked artifacts for the past few years, working closely with a number of global organizations assisting in restitution efforts. And the efforts of India's Pride Project's Bring Our Gods Home initiative targets the return of hundreds of stolen deities back to India. Our last speaker is Ide Jigsaw, a practicing international criminal law attorney and human rights law practitioner, also a U.S. attorney with over a decade of experience in international law. Heidi's practice in the area of international criminal law has included cases before the International Criminal Court, the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and has involved the representation of victims, governments, and those accused. Ide is currently acting as counsel for a group of Afghan victims participating before the ICC. She publishes on the intersection between cultural heritage and international law and international criminal and human rights law, and is the author of an Antiquities Coalition policy brief, How Can Cultural Heritage Threatened by Globalization and Environmental Destruction Be Protected? Looking at the crimes against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer as a potential legal remedy. So that's our distinguished panelists, and I think we'll begin to address our questions. And the first one I'd like to address to Neil, and that is, why is it important that policy to protect cultural heritage is proactive, and who should be involved in creating and implementing this type of international policy? Neil?
Thank you, James, and thank you everybody for logging in. Well, I think, as you heard in that very fulsome introduction, I've been involved in studying the illicit trade in antiquities and other cultural objects now for about 25 years. And the reason I became involved was in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. There was a lot of looting in Iraq at the time, particularly South Iraq, archaeological sites and also museums around the country. And I think at the time we weren't so aware of the archaeological sites, but we're becoming more aware of it now. But anyway, at the time it was seen as being this great cultural catastrophe, cultural emergency, and the powers that be at Cambridge University, where I work, saw fit to establish the Illicit Antiquities Research Centre, partly in response to this emergency. So my introduction to the field, if you like, was this massive emergency in cultural heritage terms of looting in Iraq. And I can say my career since then, the 25 years since then, it seems quite often to have been nothing but a continuing succession of emergencies, one after the other. I could recite them here, but I don't think you need me to. And in that experience, I mean, I think the only thing I can say with any certainty about an emergency is it won't be the last one, and we will forget about it when the next one occurs. And that is really my experience. As we have an emergency, it attracts a lot of attention, media attention, policy attention, even funding attention. And then that all moves on to the next emergency when the next emergency happens. And after 25 years of these recurring emergencies, it's quite clear that their recurrence is an indication that policy isn't working, policy has failed. We're just jumping from one emergency to another reactively. We're not stopping them happening. And we really need to fall back and think about that. You know, my opinion, and there might be other opinions, I'm not saying I have the only opinion here, it is there needs to be much more proactive, investigative law enforcement. I mean, it's quite obvious, like you can read in the newspapers, anybody can read in the newspapers about various seizures and confiscations of material. And the same names come up all the time as the traders involved in this, as the smugglers or the enablers or the facilitators. And yet nothing ever seems to happen to them. And it's not a big secret who they are. As I say, they're in all the newspapers. I'm sure UNESCO knows about them, Interpol knows about them. And yet it never seems to be an issue. I mean, they're just left alone to carry on, and they'll be involved in the next emergency. So, you know, my question is, why isn't something being done about these people, the criminals, the international criminals, who are underpinning a lot of the illicit trade and ultimately the looting of archaeological sites? So yes, I think it really is a law enforcement issue. I think we need more investigative police action. And I think alongside the police and law enforcement personnel here, you do need experts in the field, whether they be art historians or archaeologists or provenance researchers or whatever. And also it needs funding. You know, we need sustained funding so we can build up permanent investigative units. All these temporary projects, we see millions and millions of dollars and euros and pounds. They go on temporary 1, 2, 3 year projects, and then the projects end and all work ends. And the money's wasted, in my opinion. The money would be much better spent funding permanent units with a mandate to investigate and prosecute these crimes, which ultimately underpin the looting of archaeological sites around the world. So that's my considered opinion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Neil. I think you've identified the issue, and I think I'd like to call on Isper to talk a little further about this issue by looking at the conflict in Syria as a case study. So, how could proactive international policy have helped protect culture from destruction, looting, and trafficking in Syria? Isper?
Thank you very much, Jem. Actually, I mean, in Syria, even before the conflict, and even other countries like Yemen, Iraq, Libya, they are very similar in their problem. I mean, in Syria, just one example. I mean, the Syrian government ratified the Convention of 1970, but our Syrian cultural heritage law is in 1963. So it was very, very old law. So, for example, UNESCO and other international heritage organizations, they should really can make a kind of warning look to the states which they ratified the 1970 law, but they didn't activate it. So, for example, we have a big international problem that a lot of countries, they have really very bad law, which are not updated to the international law. So this is one thing which is really very, very important. Another big problem as well. So in a lot of countries in Middle East, especially countries are very rich with their cultural heritage, we have a lot of international missions. So all the archaeological missions who come to work, just they want to excavate and do research. They were not at all interested to develop this infrastructure and the training of the people. So they've in Syria till 2011, we had like almost 120 international archaeological missions. And all of those archaeological missions, they were just excavating and doing research and excavating. So all the materials that they got from their excavation, no data and no, how we say, are not like putting in digitalized in a database. So all of that are just in storage houses, museums as well. They weren't at all without any digitalization. So all the data of the archaeological objects just in papers. So when the conflict started, just was the main target, and still for till now, that the heritage authority in Syria just was very concentrated on the digitalization of the archaeological objects. And this was big failure because the international community could, all the international archaeological missions, even UNESCO, even all of those organizations, they could really explain that there is a need to digitalize and to create a database of the archaeological objects. So this is something, unfortunately, still in a lot of countries, we need to create kind of a monitor system in which, where there are countries also in risk of conflict or of protests or of international natural disaster, there is a need, I think, to make a warning system. So a warning system in which the countries can have like a priority to attend and to be able to adapt to their mechanism. So now, as Anil mentioned, so all the attention now is going to Ukraine. The looting is now increasing in Syria, is increasing in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, nobody talking about that. So this is really a big failure that, unfortunately, the international policymakers are affected by the media. And this is really a big failure. We need really to create a system in which, or an international body in which could monitor all of these problems and about the protection of cultural heritage.
Thank you so much, Isper. I think the situation in Syria clearly gives us a warning of what can happen without that kind of proactive attention. Next, we'll ask BJ, what proactive policy would you recommend to help fight illicit trade in cultural property or help facilitate restitutions and returns, as you've been so involved in recent years?
Thanks a lot for this elite panel, and happy to be part of this and giving India a voice, because quite often India is forgotten as somebody who's been subject to looting for over a millennia. We've always been target of art crime right from the colonial times. And I think we don't need any new policy. I think the world needs to understand that what is required is just common law. A common law clearly says a stolen object continues to be a stolen object. No amount of passage of time can make a stolen object legit. I think the art world is in this self-belief or a misbelief that the 1970 UN statute is some magic line that miraculously washes stolen objects. And that's the reason why you see probably in the last 10 years, I think India has made leapfrog success in restitution. Almost every single one of them had fake provenance paperwork with the date of 1968 to 1970. And I had the pleasure of talking to many curators in museums, well-minded curators on the rights of the art market, who think that anything bought prior to 1970, presumably that left India before 1970, is somehow sacrosanct and cannot be touched, which is completely untrue. India has had its patrimony laws going back to the 1870s, and if we can prove that it's theft that's stolen, they have to return the object back. Just that we have to go to court and cannot invoke the UN statute. Now, the world needs to understand that this is not a soft crime. We've had cases of a museum professional who's gone missing. He was a whistleblower in Calcutta. We've got priests who've been killed safeguarding their deities. We've got jewelers who melted some of these icons looking for gold have been killed. So this is something that collectors and dealers do not realize the damage it does on the ground, not to mention even the loss of faith and the destruction to faith and the continuing tradition of 1,000-year belief system of many thousands of years. And people, quite often, dollar-driven greed is what is destroying the faith of the common man on the ground. And our objects, especially Indian objects, were never meant to be seen as piece of art. That you see them as art is only incidental. I think globally, there is they try to reduce art crime to the fringes, and we see that most police forces have skeleton art crime units, and they are going down. And even the EU and the US are coming up with tougher policies with regard to dealers and linking them to banking acts. There is always a loophole. If you take 1998, the Swathibi scandal, the market moved from UK into the US. And then in 2007, the US started getting active. Then they go back to the UK, and I think post-Brexit. So the water will always find its way. I think there is a need for the global community to first of all realize that this is not an innocent crime, and millions of dollars are moved around, and collecting is not reduced to billionaire collectors right now. You've got people who are collecting not just for the joy of collecting, but also for money laundering, tax evasion, hoarding wealth, transferring wealth, and financing and funding nefarious activities, including once in India, where we have seen that the money for actual goods are being sent into India through Hawala channels, and most heritage sites are targeted by not so good people who are not going to use this money from the proceeds of art crime for very good activities. So I think globally we need something with teeth. I'm happy to say that the only art criminal who spent more than a decade in bars is currently an under trial in India, and no other country has actually put anybody over 6 months behind bars for art crime in the last 50 years. And I think it is something that we need to clearly look at it. No point in having regulations and laws if it cannot be enforced. There's no teeth to any of these regulations. They're only recommendations for source nations. So I think it's time. Even the Interpol, for example, they think by putting up a few pieces of art in the art, like a stolen artworks registry, you can get it. We've all worked the art crime market. The art crime market fences objects for 40 years, 50 years. So I think what is required is a global art squad that's aided by expert people with stringent laws and regulations to treat this as not just fringe crimes, but a crime against humanity. Thank you.
You're on mute, James.
Thank you, Vijay. I think you've highlighted in a very important point about enforcement and the need for effective enforcement and dedicating the resources to that. But of course, without the kind of proactive protection, the kind of legal remedies and policies in place, it makes enforcement much more difficult. So, Ida, can you talk a little bit about the legal remedies or policies you think could be developed to protect from non-conflict threats to cultural property?
Well, thanks very much, James, and thanks to the Antiquities Coalition for organizing this discussion. So when we think about damage and destruction to cultural heritage, we often think about this in the context of war. whether it's the destruction of the Buddhas in Afghanistan by the Taliban, or shelling of the Starry Most Bridge in Mostar, or even more recent reports about attacks on cultural heritage in Ukraine and Syria and so many other conflict zones. Much of the dialogue of international law is centered on what to do when cultural heritage is targeted and impacted during an armed conflict. But what might be even more prevalent and pose a greater risk to preserving and to protecting cultural heritage occurs outside of war and during times of peace in certain locations. Globalization, such as large-scale development projects, exploration and extraction of natural resources, deforestation, and the effects of climate change, which itself sees roots in and is exacerbated by globalization. All of these pose significant risks to cultural heritage. And what reports have indicated is that globalization and climate change lead to environmental damage, abusive land acquisitions, and climate disasters like floods, fires, and droughts, which either destroy the land on which the cultural heritage is located and the cultural objects and places with it, or it forces those people who value that cultural heritage to flee and to move, leaving their cultural heritage on that land and inaccessible to them, and potentially the traditions and practices associated with that culture. So just as an example, we can look to the Three Gorges Dam, which impacted significantly cultural heritage, archaeological sites and cultural sites in those locations, or even to deforestation and land allocation policies in Kenya, which threaten cultural heritage of the Kikuyu people around Mount Kenya, which has itself cultural significance and religious significance to the lakes and the trees that are considered sacred there. So just some examples of this in practice. So what can be done about this, and specifically what can be done under the law? I approach this question from the perspective of international law, and specifically under international human rights and international criminal law. And I have to admit that the law is a bit tricky as it functions as a remedy for actions which have already taken place and harm that has already occurred. So while these areas of law cannot preemptively address these actions, what can is the education on these remedies that are available, advocacy to potential victims, and promotion of these remedies to create a deterrence. So this also includes thinking creatively about how the law can be used when it seems that there is no direct remedy, and raising awareness of these possible recourses to affected groups, to governments, and even to potential perpetrators. So with that in mind, I just want to raise one example under international criminal law, and particularly the ICC, which could be a potential remedy. So at the ICC, the war crime of attacks against cultural heritage is in the Rome Statute. But again, this requires that the crime is committed during an armed conflict. So this reality leaves a gap in recourse when victims are harmed by cultural heritage, when the cultural heritage they value is destroyed or damaged during times of peace. And so these examples of large-scale development projects or climate change. So with this reality, there is no specific crime at the ICC to cover cultural heritage impacted outside of war. So in that case, I looked to the link between cultural heritage, the environment, and land under international law, and suggest that this might provide a potential opportunity for alternative remedies through the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer. And this is the policy brief that I wrote for the Antiquities Coalition. So under international law, this link or connectivity has been repeatedly recognized, whether it's by the Covenant and Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the International Inter-American Human Rights System. It's recognized that land is singularly important to the development of communities' spiritual, cultural life, and integrity. So when we look at the crime of forceful transfer at the ICC, which is when a group is forced within a country, or deportation when a group is forced across a border, we look for conduct by perpetrators which constitutes coercive acts which force people to flee. This can be repetitive acts, including destruction of land or property, but also deprivation of fundamental human rights. So we're looking to the right to culture, to practice of one's religion, to natural resources, or to work. These are acts that coerce people to move. It shows the applicability of situations where a group is deprived of their rights of access and ownership over property and the ability to practice their culture caused by development, land acquisitions, or climate change, which forces a community or a group from their land and from the culture that's associated with that land. So when occurring on a widespread or systematic level in that location, we can look to it as a crime against humanity and potentially, depending on the jurisdiction, look to whether it could be a remedy before the ICC. So raising that as a potential crime that could be looked at when we don't see a specific crime under international law, but seeing how other crimes can be applicable to those situations. Of course, the international human rights system also includes remedies on the enumerated rights of the right to culture, to religion, to the right to development, to education, to work, and those are can be looked at a remedy before places like the UN, the human rights tribunals, and other places like that. So those are all remedies that we can look to under international law.
Thank you so much, Ida. I think, and thank you all the panelists for raising these issues. I think we'll have an opportunity to discuss them a little further as a group. And I think that that Ida's presentation led us to probably the first discussion question I'd like to pose, and that effective cultural policy requires a diverse network of stakeholders from different disciplines. So who's being left out of this conversation at this point? Who are the new voices that should be brought in? And I'll open the floor to our various panelists to weigh in.
Can I say something?
Please.
I think, to my mind, that there are two groupings that we're missing out on. And again, I'm talking here about the illicit trade in antiquities and cultural objects. And one grouping is a disciplinary grouping, which you might broadly call social science, but which would include economists and criminologists. And these are people who will have a much better understanding of alternative approaches to the problem at hand, either from a criminological point of view or from a market or economic point of view. And I don't think we have anything like enough input from these social science people, whether they're economists or criminologists or whoever. And then the other group, in a way, are organizations or people like us who are tackling other illicit trades, and the obvious one is the trade in wildlife or other natural products or whatever, because these groups have got similar experiences and many of the problems they're facing are similar, but they might have divergent approaches. And I think they have a lot to offer as well. So I think we really need to reach out to, the people generally involved, at an academic level, are archaeologists, art historians, lawyers, these type of people. I think we really need to start reaching out to other groupings, economists, I've mentioned criminologists, and perhaps people who are specialists in international relations or public policy, all these type of areas, social science areas. They're the first group. And then the second group, as I say, is we really need to start looking at other illicit trades around us and see what approaches are being used there, what's been successful and what hasn't been successful. So I think that's what I would do.
Thank you. Whisper, please.
Actually, I think a key a group which we need really to integrate them on this is local communities and local NGOs. So from our experience in our organization, Heritage for Peace, we created a network of several civil society organizations in Arab countries, especially in the countries where there are conflicts: Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iraq. It's ANSH, Arab Network of Civil Society Organization to Safeguard Cultural Heritage. So with ANSH and with local activists or even small NGOs, we observed how, and we saw how those people are really able to identify and to identify to show up the problem. So those groups, they can identify, for example, looted artifacts. Sometimes, I mean, in several countries, we have a big problem between states and civil society. So especially in authoritarian and dictatorship governments, always the relationship was very, very bad. So now with the conflicts and with the revolution in these areas, and not just in Syria or in other or in the Middle East, in other countries, civil society is really became the main player to fill the gap in healthcare and humanitarian aid, and as well in heritage protection. So international policymakers, they should really keep attention and aware to empower civil society organization. I mean, the civil society organization who were created to protect cultural heritage, they are suffering of lack of international support. They are suffering of lack of funding, of expertise as well. So we need really to think how we can empower those local in order to create a tool as well. They are fantastic, and they are very able to identify a provenance, how we say provenance materials to show that they were looting, you know. So, for example, create tools for those locals, and that will help a lot as well to empower them, and to as well to make the international community more aware about this their role and the gap that they can fill on this subject.
Ida.
Sure. I have to completely agree about engaging with local communities and NGOs. I think that's such an important point. From the perspective of the issue that I addressed about cultural heritage that can be impacted by globalization and by climate change, I think this is also important to not only engage with local communities, but also connect the dots on how the process that is often gone through in these development process of the international standards for free, prior, and informed consent that corporations and companies often have to engage with communities about. So engaging with those local communities to raise awareness about their rights under international human rights law and international criminal law, and how, as I said before, the land is connected to the environment and also to the rights to culture as well. So during those, the process of consultations, and that local communities are not only able to raise their perspective about the land, but how that is connected to the culture as well. So I think that's something that could be worked on in order to help those communities fully and meaningfully engage in those consultation projects, and also to raise awareness with corporations themselves of those obligations that come with it.
Okay, thank you. DJ,
Yeah, I think we should engage schools and colleges, and I think there are not too many academic courses that even talk about case laws. I know Neil and Antiquities Coalition put out a lot of case studies online, as do a few other organizations, but I hardly find that. And whenever I interact with, I think the next generation in schools and colleges, and I think that's where there are not too many academic courses and quite a number of courses that we need to follow. For example, they have no understanding of international laws and regulations. So I think if we could rope in academic institutions of repute to come up with small add-on programs, that will help to create more warriors on the right side of the art market.
There's a question from the audience that's right on point that what's in the opinion of the panelists is the role of storytellers, journalists, documentary makers, photographers in driving policy change and changing public opinion in regards to the urgency of the problem of cultural heritage destruction.
I'll take you up on that again, because I've written a nonfiction work on this, and the book has been optioned. It's not easy to find funding for these projects because obviously you don't have gunfights. It is something that is visually appealing, and we've had one on Netflix on the Pathan marble. So I think there is more that needs to be done in terms of because of course the visual medium, there's no other thing, but the interest is growing. I wish channels come up with more intrusive work, because I think Al Jazeera did a sting on Nepal, which created quite a number of interests, and I'm really hoping to see more. Not just Narcos. We should have our own version of Narcos for heritage crime. Thank you.
Can I contribute to that? This is really very important, especially journalists. So in Arabic region and Middle East, we don't have really trained journalists who talk about the problem. So all the information that we know about looting, even in Syria or in Iraq, or come from a big journalist working in Washington or in Europe. So in Arabic region, we really need to train journalists in order to be able to work and to give writing about this problem and to raise awareness, because we have always this mentality in Middle East: if you loot, you will be rich, so there's also all these ideas about excavating, about finding treasures. So I think international big organization, they should really try to work with governments in order to enhance governments to train journalists and in their ministries of media, of culture, that there should be a kind of training on that.
I'd like to follow up as well, if I could, please. I mean, I think, journalists are central to the solution, really. And if we look at some of the big scandals of the past 20 years, and when I say scandals, it's really the uncovering of criminal or other activities. Journalists have been centrally involved, and we can mention the Sotheby's case in London and the spin-offs from that, the Getty in Los Angeles, Kapoor. These are big cases, and they've resulted in major changes in institutional policy, and journalists were centrally involved in all of those cases. So it's quite clear that journalists have a very important role to play. And I'm the first one to say that. But unfortunately, there's also a class of journalists who I consider to be lazy or time wasters, where they're just seizing on a story which is already out there, and they want a talking head to give a comment, and they don't really care what that comment is, as long as it kind of fits in with the narrative which is out there. And then they go off. I tend to get bombarded by questions from journalists of this second type who want me virtually to write an article for them or to answer millions of questions. And I could spend all my life answering journalistic inquiries of that type. And they're just time wasters, really. So I think on the one hand, you've got some excellent journalism out there. It's been game-changing, and it's massively important. But on the other side, there's a lot of journalism which is just wasting time, really. And it can be counterproductive if it's giving a false picture of what's happening. So we saw in Syria, there were lots of parties engaged in looting and trafficking in Syria. And yet around about 2015, 2016, there were lots of journalists who just wanted to blame it all on Daesh. And that gave a completely false picture of what was really happening. So that was completely unhelpful. So yeah, I think journalism is essential on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a bit of a two-edged sword.
Ida, I think you had some thoughts.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on the importance of potentially providing training. I agree that journalists are invaluable when it comes to addressing these issues. Specifically in the context of conflicts, oftentimes what we see is that journalists are on the ground when things are occurring and are able to witness and even document some of the crimes that are taking place. And so when we think about best practices for gathering and preserving evidence, and sometimes that's coming from journalists, the importance of providing some kind of training, manuals, best practices to journalists so that we can make sure that this invaluable evidence and information that they have been able to communicate to others and to find can be preserved and be used during legal proceedings to help move towards justice, accountability, and prevention in the future as well.
Thank you all. Any other thoughts before I pose another question? Well, I think we all understand that that poor understanding equals poor policy. So what is needed to ensure that policy makers have the tools they need to address this issue? BJ?
Well, I think you hit it on the nail, especially I'll talk from experience in India. We have a lot of influencers from the collecting lobby influencing policy. And we do know the same in the US as well, where the collecting lobby cabal actually pays social media influencers to influence policy. And I think we are up against very big people with deep pockets. And in fact, they had the audacity to amend an already toothless act, which is India's Antiquities Act of 1972, wherein they wanted an open market for antiquities within India in order to prevent smuggling of antiquities, as though an open market for antiquities in India, wherein not even 8% of heritage sites have so far been excavated, would miraculously stop the number one, the smuggling of antiquities, and number two, they wanted to do away with a gatekeeper for registering antiquities. So basically, you could drive on the road, pick something on the road, and bring it home, take a photograph, and register it online. And somehow this passed to the final stage, and hopefully we're fighting tooth and nail to stop this legislation. So I think I've read a lot of policy notes in Europe, for example. Both the US and the EU notes on the banking regulations is something that is remarkably done and has come up against stiff opposition. And I think it's time that other countries read this in more detail, and maybe the Antiquities Coalition and other interested people can come up with short bits wherein the essence of the juice of it is condensed and shown, because normally these politicians, policymakers don't seem to be reading these 300-page reports. So we need to give them in short bites. And I think it is definitely required that we talk more, we engage more. In fact, I would say that to your previous question, what we need is policymakers and politicians getting involved more, and not just in photo ops when they come to receive these statues and idols and murtis. They should be involved in the restitution process to understand the hoops that we have to go through for each one of these restitutions. They just come for the photo ops. and if they know the trouble that we go through to get these back. So I think what is important is that we should expose museums. We should expose, like, I don't want to name the museum, but the most prominent museum in America has been repeatedly giving back antiquities to source nations, as they call us, without naming who they bought it from. So what is the point of it? We can prove one or two restitution cases. So unless the dealers, the network, the restorers who aided and abetted the transporters, the intermediate countries like Hong Kong and Switzerland that aided these are exposed. So I think museums returning objects should not be celebrated unless they give full disclosure. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's important as well to create a kind of funding measures or funding tool to support small NGOs. So, for example, we faced a lot of small organizations. They don't have any access to international funding because they, in order to get funding, they need to improve that they had before more funding. And it's very, very difficult to, this is really something we need to think about, how small local groups in conflicts or in areas where there are disasters, they can get access to international funding. So we are unfortunately facing a big problem on heritage protection. All the big funding is going to big organizations, international organization, and the money are like going to big salaries in USR or in Europe. So the people who are should be in the country and get more funding, they are getting less of what they should get. So this is something really so also international projects or big fundings, they should be really like the measure of the budget should be in the country, not the big salaries of heritage advisors in Europe or United States. This one thing. I think it's very important to combine heritage protection to humanitarian aid. So we know, for example, a lot of humanitarian aid emergency in conflict or even in disaster, they could contribute to combat illicit traffic, and they can create a lot of raising awareness. I think also through humanitarian aid, they can, in Syria, in other countries, we have a lot of people just they loot because they survive. They need to survive. They cannot really, they don't have any income, so in case if humanitarian aid organizations are informed about this issue, and they can act in coordination with heritage productions organization. So I think now we really need to create new systems in which humanitarian organizations, they can contribute to protect heritage in a crisis.
I'd like to add on to when you're talking about funding, I really want you to be careful of who you take your funds from. In the past, we have seen a lot of these organizations have hidden agendas. They call themselves by fancy names, but they're linked to some collectors, some auction houses. So from our side, we've taken a policy that we'll not take a dollar dime cent from anybody, and we rely purely on the blood, sweat, and toil of our volunteers, and it's quite worked well for the last 16, 17 years. Again, country specific is there, but I would just request you to be really, really careful, pick and choose the partners you work with, because it is never a no strings attached offer. I'm not talking about any other trade, but especially in the antiquities trade, you are asked to say or redact things at a later stage because you offend your masters. So from my policy is that you could say that it comes with us. We don't bow down to anybody. And I think the independence, especially in this trade, because you're taking on powerful cartels and politicians, it's always better to be right in the center, not to lean with any of this. But again, I do see where you come from, you might need, but please be careful of who you align with and take funding from. Thank you.
Well, in our last 5 minutes, the end is coming so fast. We had such great discussions, but I'd like to ask each of our panelists if they have any last thoughts about our overall topic, and that is how do we be more proactive? What are your primary objectives for the Antiquities Coalition and others of us who are concerned with this issue? So may I start with Neil?
Yes, I mean, listening to the panelists, I think we've all been kind of talking around a central theme, but there have been certain divergences which might sound contradictory, though I don't think they are. And I hate to say this because I'm really fed up with seminars and workshops and so on and so forth. But I think there really is a need really for like-minded people to sit down and try and hammer out what they would think would be a productive policy or a productive way forward, or what we need. And, you know, certain elements have popped up time and again here. We need, like, you know, a central investigative unit. We need more research. We need more involvement of NGOs on the ground. I mean, these ideas are bubbling around. And I think we really need to be able to get a group of like-minded people, as I say, to sit down and formalize it all in some way. And I think then you have a document that you can promote. And whether you want to take it to UNESCO or you want to take it to the United Nations or the G20 or wherever, you can do.
Okay. Thanks, Tess. It looks like we have a charge for the Antiquities Coalition. Other thoughts from the other panelists?
Okay, I think there's one opportunity that's opening up in the sense that I see a lot of requests from people, maybe second generation holders of art, which is orphaned art, wanting to quietly do the right thing and return it back. I think if we as say Antiquities Coalition, somebody can be the interface, because quite often they don't know what to do and they're scared to go to law enforcement. They're scared about the publicity. I think the New York District Attorney is making a good example by giving people an opportunity to do the right thing. I think globally, we need to realize that, you know, people, if they want to return, there should be a channel which is promoted, where when you know it's a good faith purchase and they then realize that it's bad. I think there should be a window of opportunity for people to do the right thing, and maybe the international community could come up with like a restitution week where people are encouraged to show up and instead of just throwing it out in the garages or on the gardens, maybe they could just run it back. And that's just one of my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Whisper?
Yeah. I think we need more coordination. I mean, even now the policy failure is there is a big lack of coordination between law enforcement, international heritage organization, governments. So this is really a big problem, that the lack of coordination. So I think we, as Neil said, we need like international unit, bring everyone together, academia, civil society, states, international organizations. Sometimes we are facing that the academia people are sometimes involved, and they are involved on that, but their work is sometimes not effective as should be, because they are nobody in the policymaker are reading the academia publication about that. So a lot of papers, a lot of publication about that, but unfortunately the policymakers are so far off that. So we need really to create a system in which all of that is coordinated. We cannot just put all our hope in Interpol or in Carabinieri or in UNESCO and ICOM, because we saw that still this coordination between themselves, it doesn't work. So I think this is really a big need in order to take a step against this big problem.
Thank you. Well, we're reaching the end of our time, but I want to give Ide a chance for a last word.
Thank you. I acknowledge that when I've been addressing this topic, I do so from a bit of a unique perspective of the international human rights law, and more so on attacks and actions that impact cultural heritage by damaging and destroying it. But I think what we've heard between all of us is that coordination, education, promotion of legal remedies that are available and awareness is so important, and seeing how these different areas of laws can work together to come to a common purpose. I think that creating that awareness of the rights for communities that are impacted, and then also on the obligations of governments and actors who impact cultural heritage is so important, and looking to ones that might not be directly obvious on the law, getting a bit creative, seeing what other sources of law might be able to help for that common purpose. So I would look forward to having more discussions on this with everyone.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for your thoughts on this. I think you've identified many of the ways that we could proceed further with new laws, with empowering non-governmental organizations, with coordination, engaging new communities. And I think it's something that is essential to take forward, because being reactive is not solving our problems. So I want to thank you for your contributions. Again, thank the audience for listening. And I want to remind you that this will be recorded. If you need access of that, would you please contact the Antiquities Coalition, and the coalition thanks you for your attention and your participation, and wish you a good remainder of your day. Thank you.